Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Glad that you're here on this special day. It is a really exciting time to be a part of what God is doing at St. Albert Alliance Church, and I'm pumped. I'm excited for Pastor Kirk to come. He has his first day in the office with us on Tuesday. I'm looking forward to that. It's like this feeling of being on the top of the roller coaster and thinking, this is so exciting. I'm a little bit nervous too, but I'm really pumped and excited. And yet at the same time, there's a part of my heart that's grieving as well, because I've absolutely loved the gift that this year has been, and sitting under Carl's leadership as he and Michelle have served us so humbly, so sacrificially. And I've learned a lot from Carl this year. So I'm celebrating and I'm grieving all at the same time. But all that being said, it is a good time to be a part of what Jesus is doing at St. Albert Alliance Church. I'm so glad that you're a part of it with us, even if this is your first time here this morning. It's good that you're here to experience this family moment, get a little bit of an inside perspective of what's happening in the life of our church family. We're just so delighted to share that with you. Today, in our time of teaching, we're going to continue on in our series called Building Blocks for Life as we study the book of Nehemiah. And as we take our time in Nehemiah over the course of these weeks, it'll take us almost right up to Easter, we're asking God to help us grow in our own lives as we learn from Nehemiah's example and how God worked and moved in his life. And over the course of the last 3 weeks, we've looked at 3 unique building blocks so far. So we've looked at Nehemiah chapter 1 and how God stirred a holy discontent, a burden, a longing in Nehemiah's life to see something that wasn't right be made right. So the walls of the once great city of Jerusalem were in ruins, and this was a very difficult thing. It was a vulnerable, it was a shameful thing for the Jewish people, and God stirred Nehemiah's heart to do something about it. In response to this holy discontent that we looked at in week 1, we see that Nehemiah turned immediately to prayer, and this was our second building block as we looked at Nehemiah chapter 1 and 2 and saw that how Nehemiah's vibrant prayer life, like conversation with God, was just such a normal and ongoing thing, and his desire to be used by God, to partner with God in real time in the places where he lived and worked, really moved him to spirit-empowered action. And God brought about, and we'll see over the course of the weeks to come, some really beautiful kingdom-oriented change and transformation as a result. And last week, Pastor Mike shared from Nehemiah chapter 3. And we looked at how Nehemiah brought other people together to join him in his work. The holy discontent began in Nehemiah's heart, yes, but Nehemiah needed other people to come with him to help bring the project about. Many people had a very significant part to play in meeting the need. Nehemiah couldn't address the holy discontent on his heart alone, by himself. And today, we're going to be looking at the building block of courage from Nehemiah chapter 4. And we're going to look at how we can remain steadfast and perseverant in the face of opposition. Because isn't this often the case? We decide to lean into a holy discontent that's stirring in our hearts. We decide to lean into a longing or a burden to see something that is not right be made right in a certain way. And at some point, things get hard and our efforts are opposed. We see this happen with Nehemiah and the Jewish people. Everyone's gotten to work. Things are going well. They're working together as a team. They are making progress. This impossible project is getting off the ground. Things are going well until they are not. And this is where we are now. Things have hit a bit of a snag and opposition has come. So let's look at what's going on in Nehemiah 4. In Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, we read, Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap and charred ones at that? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "That stone wall would collapse even if a fox walked along the top of it." So here we see Sanballat and Tobiah. They are foreigners, they are not Jewish people, but they live in the area, and they're very upset. They're very irritated, you can tell, to see that Nehemiah and the people of Israel are rebuilding the wall. Now, why would this be? Well, one reason could be that if Israel were to remain weak and vulnerable, if they were to remain in that position, then the surrounding nations had a little bit less to be concerned about. While they might vie for position and power amongst each other, Israel would continue to remain almost a non-factor. It also could be that it's likely that the surrounding nations have heard stories about the God of Israel and how he brought about victory after victory for the Jewish people when they entered into the promised land. They may have had questions, like, would the strengthening of the Israelite people now mean that their God would once again work and move on their behalf as he did before? This could have caused some unsettledness for them. And so we see them now begin to taunt, mock, and intimidate in an effort to get Nehemiah to abandon the dream of rebuilding the walls. So how does Nehemiah respond to this, to the taunting and the mocking and intimidation? Well, we see that he immediately, once again, he returns to prayer. We see this all throughout the book of Nehemiah. We can't miss this. One scholar that I read said that Nehemiah's response to crisis was instinctually to go to prayer. It was like that was the first impulse he had. I would love to grow more like this, that when crisis hits my life, it would be even more than I am now, that it would be more instinctual. Because I don't know if I'd say it's completely instinctual for me. I can try to fix a lot of things and run around for a little while before I listen to the Holy Spirit's nudge to say, hey, sit with me in this. Come to me first. But for Nehemiah, we see this instinctual response to go to prayer in a crisis. And God ministers deeply. And we see that the Jewish people rally and they continue their work. This taunting and mocking and intimidating, it is not enough to cause them to stop. They continue their work and they finish the wall up to half its height. So they've made a lot of progress in some difficult circumstances. But now we see that things begin to escalate even further. No longer do Sanballat and Tobiah merely taunt or mock them, but they actually begin to threaten them with physical violence. And on top of that, they get more people on their side. It's almost like, okay, we see the Jewish people rallying. Well, we're going to rally some people too. We're going to see if we can turn up the heat a little bit. And so we see that the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites come to join them. So the amount of people opposing Nehemiah and the people of Israel is growing. And this is where things get really difficult. In Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 7 to 12, we read, "But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard that the work was going ahead and that the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. They all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. But we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. But then the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired, and there's so much rubble to be moved. We'll never be able to build the wall by ourselves." Meanwhile, our enemies were saying, "Before they know what's happening, we'll swoop down on them and kill them and end their work." The Jews who lived near the enemy camp came and told us again and again, "They will come from all directions and attack us." So now we see that people are really afraid. They want to give up. They're actually wrestling with whether or not to rebuild the wall is worth it. So this project, this holy discontent that's been stirred in the heart of Nehemiah, they now have all taken some ownership for that. It matters to them. And they're beginning to question whether or not it's even worth it to go on. Can you imagine how difficult this would have been? What kinds of holy discontent have been stirred on your heart? And as you begin to move in it and experience opposition, how quickly does it happen sometimes where we're maybe willing to step away from something that meant so much because It's getting really hard. I know I've experienced that. And now they're being threatened with physical violence. And this brings a whole other element to the insecurity that they are feeling. I remember a time in high school when someone threatened me with physical violence. I was 17 or 18 years old. I was in grade 12, and my twin sister and I were at an ATM at a mall in Regina, Saskatchewan. And we were at the ATM getting our money when 4 women that we didn't know surrounded us and began to make fun of us. That's how it started. It started out with them saying things like, oh, like, don't you girls think you're special getting money to go shopping and those kinds of things. And right away, when like fight, flight, freeze starts to come up, because you're like, this is not a good situation. I began to feel that right away. And I began to get really scared when they said things like, I wonder if we could manage to get a little bit of that money for ourselves. Wonder if we should go for a walk, ladies. What do you think? I wouldn't mind having some of that money you have. I was terrified. I was so scared. I remember desperately praying. I think I started sweating. I was shaking, like my central nervous system was kicking into high gear. And I remember turning around. I do not remember what I said. I have no idea what I said right now. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. You know what that's like. But I said something. I don't know what it was. Or God just did something. And they turned around and walked away and left us alone. Oh, I was so relieved. But there was no shopping for Joy and I that day. We got our money. We walked 30 minutes home. And the whole time we walked home, I was shaking and looking over my shoulder. I was terrified. And we didn't go back to that mall for months because of how scary that encounter was for us. So I can just imagine that the people who are coming to Nehemiah, who are hearing these threats of physical violence, I can imagine some of them probably came shaking. This was real to them. Like, we're in trouble. We are in danger. And this would have been so difficult enough that they're ready to abandon a project that means everything to them. So what's Nehemiah's response? How does he lead the people that God's entrusted to him? Well, we see Nehemiah do 2 things. He turns to God in prayer again, and he implements a strategy. You see, Nehemiah saw no conflict between full-on trust and dependence on God and obedient action on his part. He sees no contradiction between faith in God to act and move as only God can act and move, and his own responsibility to walk in wisdom and obedience. In Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 13 to 20, we read, "So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guard by families armed with swords, spears, and bows. Then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people and said to them, 'Do not be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord, who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.' When our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to work on the wall. But from then on, only half my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of maul. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah who were building the wall. The laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. All the builders had a sword belted to their side, and the trumpeter stayed with me to sound the alarm. Then I explained to the nobles and officials and all the people, the work is very spread out, and we're widely separated from each other along the wall. But when you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever it is sounding. Then our God will fight for us." So in this passage, Nehemiah says one of my favorite statements in the entire Bible. I return to it again and again and again. He says, "Do not be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord, who is great and glorious." He's saying, I know this is hard. I know the threat is real, but remember the Lord. Do not process what you are experiencing right now with God on the outside of it. Don't process it with him outside. Bring him right in. Remember him. Nehemiah doesn't diminish the seriousness of what they're facing. He acknowledges the very realness of this opposition. And we see this in part through the extensive strategy that he puts in place. Families are standing guard. Only half the people are building, the other half are protecting. There's a trumpeter in place to sound an alarm to bring even more people to a certain area if reinforcements are needed. Those who are building are holding their load in one hand and they have a weapon in the other. Like they're ready should anything happen. But this strategy is launched by Nehemiah imploring the people to turn their gaze, to turn their focus on the one who is bigger, the one who is stronger, the one who is more powerful than any threat. Nehemiah implements a very effective strategy, yes, to stand against the opposition they are facing. But even in the implementation of this strategy, his attention is on God. It is his confidence in God that is his focus, and his focus on God never wavers. So their courage did not come from their strategy, I don't believe, not for Nehemiah. Rather, the strategy that Nehemiah had came from great courage in God. So courage didn't come from the strategy, courage came from God. And this is the key here. Strategies are so important, and in a few minutes I'll share with you one very simple strategy I have to walk in courage. But it is not our strategies that actually give us the courage to face the opposition or the threats that we may encounter as we seek to move in obedience to the holy discontent that God is stirring in our hearts. Courage comes from knowing God and being with God and walking with God and trusting that it is ultimately God who will bring about his desire and purposes in the holy discontent he's stirring in our hearts. It is God who will make things happen. Remember in verse 20, I just read this. Nehemiah said, when you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever it is sounding. Then our God will fight for us. So Nehemiah wasn't confused. They would do their part. They had their weapons. They would go to where the alarm sounded. But it wasn't them who would bring the victory. It was God. And we've been singing about this all morning. We've been singing that every victory is God's. We've been singing, when we see you, Jesus, we find strength to face the day. In your presence, our fears are washed away. It is in the presence of God that we receive the courage we need to walk in obedience, come what may. You know, as I reflect on what we see in Nehemiah as he faces opposition, my heart is stirred because I first and foremost see a person who knew God. Man, do I want that to be true of me. I see a person who trusted God, a person who relied on the presence and power of God, a person who lived close to God and kept turning to God again and again and again and again. There's more trouble, back to God. More resistance, back to God. More wisdom needed, back to God. I see a person who didn't underestimate God and overestimate himself. I have a tendency to do that sometimes, and maybe I'm not the only one in this room who sometimes tends to put more emphasis on what I can bring to a situation, and I lag behind a little bit when needing to remember what Almighty God can bring to a situation. Our vision statement here at St. Albert Alliance Church is this: we exist to be good news to our neighbors and beyond by practicing the way of Jesus. This is a big vision. This is a big, bold, beautiful thing to say. And we need God to actually bring this about as we are faithful to do our part, as he invites us to. But it is God who will bring this about. And Nehemiah's life was experienced as good news to so many because of how he intentionally chose to walk in humble obedience to God and the courage that brought as a result. And I can't help but think that the same can be true of us. God desires for it to be true of us because his desire to partner with us in this vision, to be good news to our neighbors and beyond by practicing the way of Jesus, is no less significant than his desire and intent to partner with Nehemiah in what he was stirring in Nehemiah's heart. And you know, personally speaking, there's a holy discontent in my heart too. I have a deep longing to help people know Jesus, to really know him, what he's like, his personality, his heart, to be with him, to experience him in real time, and to live in the healing, wholeness, and freedom and restoration that Jesus has made possible for them. And this holy discontent, and how I choose to lean into it at times, is opposed in various ways. The enemy just doesn't like it very much. And one of the sweetest ways that Jesus has helped me to not be afraid of the enemy and to remember the Lord, who is great and glorious, is through the writings of C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, and in particular, how he depicts the relationship between Lucy, a daughter of Eve, which is just Lewis's fancy way of saying she was human, and Aslan, a lion, who represents Jesus in the stories. So while there are many stories throughout the 7 books that deeply minister to me, one in particular is from the 5th book in the series, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and it applies to what we're talking about today. So I'm just going to share a little bit. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we see King Caspian, the king of Narnia, with Lucy the Valiant and her brother Edmund the Just, and Durinian, the Dawn Treader's captain, along with a number of others on a mission to find and rescue the 7 good lords of Narnia that Caspian's evil uncle Miraz banished when he usurped the throne. So you could say a holy discontent burned in Caspian's heart too, to make this egregious wrong right, to bring these 7 good lords home. Their quest takes them to many places, and they face much opposition along the way, but none so personally harrowing as when they encounter the Dark Island. So the Dark Island is a desolate place. It's a place black as night, without even a sliver of light to illuminate the darkness. But the most terrible thing about the Dark Island isn't actually even the darkness, it's what takes place in the darkness. You see, the Dark Island is a place where dreams come true. But by dreams, I don't mean daydreams that are often winsome and wistful. I mean dreams that we have while sleeping that, to quote C.S. Lewis, make you afraid to go to sleep again. So this little motley crew on the Dawn Treader had an important decision to make. Do they continue with their quest to find the good lords that were unjustly banished, that would take them unavoidably to the Dark Island, or do they turn around and retreat and abandon their mission? Well, they decide to continue forward with their mission. And as they row forward into the dark mist that surrounds the island, very quickly they lose all light. So now I'd like to pick up the story and just read C.S. Lewis's words for a bit. I've condensed the story. I've taken parts out for the sake of our time, but I haven't added anything. And you'll still understand the picture he's painting here. How long this voyage into the darkness lasted, nobody knew. Except for the creaks of the rowlocks and the splash of the oars, there was nothing to show that they were moving at all. As time went on, everyone except the rowers began shivering with cold. Suddenly, from somewhere, no one's sense of direction was very clear by now, there came a cry. Either of some inhuman voice, or else a voice of one in such extremity of terror that he'd almost lost his humanity. "Mercy," cried the voice, who they later learn is Lord Roop, one of the 7 lords they sailed in search for. "Mercy. Even if you are only one more dream, have mercy. Take me aboard. Take me even if you strike me dead. But in the name of all mercies, do not fade away and leave me in this horrible land." "Where are you?" shouted Caspian. "Come aboard and welcome." Edmund thought he'd never seen a wilder-looking man. Though he didn't otherwise look very old, his hair was an untidy mop of white. His face was thin and drawn, and for clothing, only a few wet rags hung about him. But what one mainly noticed were his eyes, which were so widely open and started as if in an agony of pure fear. Caspian, trying not to look at anything, especially not to keep looking behind him, went to Captain Durinian. "Durinian," he said in a very low voice, "how long did we take rowing in? I mean, rowing to where we picked up the stranger." "5 minutes, perhaps," whispered Durinian. "Why?" "Because we've been much more than that already, trying to get out." And Durinian's hand shook on the tiller, and a line of cold sweat ran down his face. The same idea was occurring to everyone on board. We shall never get out. Never get out, moaned the rowers. He's steering us wrong. We're going round and round in circles. We shall never get out. This sounds to me like we can't build the wall. There's too much rubble. The threat's too big. We need to abandon the mission. Now the stranger, who'd been lying in a huddled heap on the deck, sat up and burst out in a horrible laugh. Never get out, he yelled. That's it. Of course. We shall never get out. What a fool I was to have thought that they would let me go that easy. No, we shall never get out. Lucy leaned her head on the edge of the fighting top and whispered, Aslan, Aslan, if ever you loved us at all, send us help now. And the darkness did not grow any less, but she began to feel a very, very little better. Look, cried Raynolf's voice hoarsely from the bows. There was a tiny speck of light ahead, and while they watched, a broad beam of light fell from the speck upon the ship. It didn't alter the surrounding darkness, but the whole ship was now lit up as if by searchlight. Lucy looked along the beam and presently saw something in it. At first it looked like a cross, and at last, with a whirring of wings, it was right overhead and was an albatross. It called out in a strong, sweet voice what seemed to be words, though no one understood them. And after that, it spread its wings, rose, and began to fly slowly ahead of them. Durinian steered after it, not doubting that it offered good guidance. But no one except Lucy knew that as it circled the mast, it had whispered to her, Courage, dear heart. And the voice she felt sure was Aslan's. And with the voice a delicious smell breathed in her face. In a few moments, the darkness turned into grayness ahead of them. Almost before they dared begin hoping, they had shot out into the sunlight and were in the warm, blue world again. And all at once, everybody realized that there was nothing to be afraid of, and there never had been. So courage, dear heart, is always before me. It is always in front of me. Just as Nehemiah called the people of Israel to not be afraid of the enemy and remember the Lord who is great and glorious, I hear the call from Jesus, courage, dear heart, literally every day. I have this picture of Aslan and Lucy in my office here at the church building. I also have it in my study, in my prayer room at home. I also have it as the picture of the lock screen on my phone. So I literally see this picture dozens and dozens and dozens of times a day. It's very meaningful for me. I also have this sign that's in my home on the main level of my house, and I see it every time I leave my room that's upstairs and come downstairs to prepare to leave my home for the day. I see this sign every day, courage, dear heart. And in a simple way, having these pictures, like the picture of Lucy and Aslan, and having this sign in meaningful places for me in my home, they are a part of my strategy to remember the Lord who is great and glorious, and not be afraid of the enemy. It's simple, but it reminds me multiple times a day to remember the Lord. And I wonder, what about for you? As you seek to walk in obedience to the things that Jesus is stirring in your heart, do you have courage strategies? Strategies that help you remember not to be afraid of the enemy, but to remember the Lord who is great and glorious. I can say in whatever Jesus is calling you to, whatever the vulnerability is, wherever the area of surrender or trust that you are walking in before him, as you walk in obedience and lean into the holy discontent that he has stirred on your heart, you can be confident in him. Strategies are good to have and we need them, but the best strategies come when they remind us to fix our gaze on Jesus and not look away, because he is the one who brings the victory. He is the one who fights for us. And I just want to say, even when it gets hard, he is with you, and he sees you, and he will fight for you. Just as Nehemiah encouraged the people of Israel, you come running, and God will fight for us. The same is true for you. You walk in obedience to him, he will be faithful to you. He will be. As we walk in obedience to his will and direction, we can know with great confidence that just as he made a way for Nehemiah and for the people of Israel, he will make a way for us too. So let's just take a few moments to bring our hearts to him as we close our service. Where in your life is Jesus whispering, courage to your heart? Or maybe there's another statement that is more meaningful for you, but where in your life right now are you needing supernatural courage that comes from the presence and power of God? Where do you need to be reminded not to be afraid of the enemy, but to remember the Lord who is great and glorious? True courage comes from being with God and trusting him in the difficulty or opposition we face to be with us. Now, as you reflect on this with Jesus now, I'd like to pray a part of Isaiah 43 over you, a part of Isaiah 43 over us, and this is from the Message paraphrase. But let's pray. Don't be afraid. I've redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine. When you're in over your head, I'll be there with you. When you're in rough waters, you will not go down. When you're between a rock and a hard place, it won't be a dead end, because I am God. I am your personal God, the Holy One of Israel. I am your Savior. Jesus, help us to take courage when things are hard. Help us to remember you, the Lord who is great and glorious, just like Nehemiah encouraged the people of Israel to do. Jesus, we thank you for the gift of your life, love, and presence. And for each person here, Lord, or each person joining us online, may you minister your peace and provision over them in practical ways. And may you supply all of the courage they need to listen to, trust, and obey you in the circumstances that they are facing today and in this season. Jesus, we ask this in your name. Amen.